It's a real honor to have an opportunity to speak to you today, and we're just going to say that was a really beautiful land acknowledgement. It was really lovely. Thank you. So I'm going to just briefly talk a little bit about a biocultural approach to One Health, sort of grounded in Indigenous rights and responsibilities. But before I do that, I just want to tell you a little bit about our lab. So I'm sort of a non-traditional academic. After my PhD, I spent 16 years working for David Suzuki, primarily leading the work of the David Suzuki Foundation with Indigenous partners across Canada and globally. I joined the University of Guelph 5 years ago, and I started a lab with my students and our Indigenous partners called the People, Plants, and Policy Lab. Our lab has sort of three ambitious goals. The first is to better understand the reciprocal relationship between Indigenous peoples and the plants that are found within their traditional territories, including those species that are particularly important for Indigenous peoples in terms of their health and well-being. We work across northern Canada, but particularly within Mi'kmaq territories, in what is now referred to as Newfoundland and Labrador, but we also have students that are working in Kurdistan, in Iran, and in the Karen Indigenous region of Myanmar. We're also very interested in looking at the customary practices that Indigenous peoples use in order to care and steward these plants. And I sometimes refer to these as people's contributions to nature. Perhaps in your courses you've learned about the concept of nature's contributions to people in terms of ecosystem goods and services, but we also forget that Indigenous peoples and local communities contribute to the maintenance and restoration of biodiversity, and by extension those benefits that they receive from nature. And then the last is that our lab is an activist lab. We are actively involved in supporting Indigenous peoples in Canada and globally in support of their fight to assert their knowledge systems, their governance, their legal norms in terms of decolonized approaches to policy and practice in Canada and globally. And I think hopefully this will be somewhat apparent in terms of my talk. The talk that I'm going to give today it's a synthesis talk, so it sort of pulls together a number of different areas of research that have been led by my students and our Indigenous partners. And it's based on a series of papers that we've been publishing recently that have sort of looked at biocultural approaches to conservation and land stewardship. In many ways, it's inspired by my mentor, the great ethnobotanist Nancy Turner, who is an emeritus professor at the University of Victoria, and her many Indigenous partners who are mostly Coast Salish people. But also I'll be telling stories of Danizaa people, which is in northeastern British Columbia, and Mi'kmaq people in Newfoundland and Labrador. Now, several years ago, there was a very important paper that was published in the journal Frontiers in Ecology and Environment. And this study found that there are few places on our planet that have been untouched by modern humans. As reported by Alison Ramankuti, more than 75% of the Earth's ice-free surface now shows evidence today of alteration by modern humans, with less than a quarter that could be described as quote-unquote wildlands. From Arctic tundra to primeval rainforest to arid desert, our natural world has been fragmented by ever-expanding towns and cities. This is an example of urban sprawl, crisscrossed with roads, transmission lines, and pipelines, and pockmarked by pump jacks, flare stacks, and other infrastructure used to pump, frack, and strip mine fossil fuels from the ground. The need to supply fuel, fibers, fresh water, and especially food to the more than 8 billion of us that now live on the planet is driving the wholesale conversion of forests, wetlands, grasslands, and other ecosystems. In fact, satellite images taken from hundreds of kilometers above the planet reveal a world today that we have irrevocably changed within a very short period of time. Now, this became particularly apparent in sharp relief in a series of maps that were developed by a researcher by the name of Timothy Golden. He's a scientist at the University of Maryland's Center for International and Security Studies. And using data from the US Defense Meteorological Program at NOAA, Golden identified contiguous lighted areas worldwide. The bright spots on the map behind me reflect the sources of light emissions at night. This is what North America looks at night. You're seeing the aggregate contribution of lit homes, powered factories, illuminated city streets, and agricultural infrastructure, which now dominates much of the planet. Golden's maps show today how much of our planet is under the direct influence of the human footprint, particularly due to urbanization. Perhaps you can see the large bright spot, which is the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area. That's where we are right now. But also the sprawling growth of commercial agriculture, as well as oil and gas development, mining, forestry, and other types of industrial land use. For example, large-scale commercial agriculture, primarily cattle ranching and cultivation of soy and oil palm, accounted for 40% of tropical deforestation between 2000 and 2010. Elsewhere, the environmental consequences of our growing footprint have been severe in some regions, resulting in the loss of wildlife habitat, degraded water quality, and widespread soil erosion. Worldwide fertilizer use alone has grown by more than 700% in the last 40 years to sustain crop yields over an ever-expanding surface area of the planet. And of course, the high seas have not escaped the breadth and reach of human activity either. Today, industrial fisheries, with its habitat destruction, pollution, and marine traffic, are threatening more than 87% of the world's oceans. Pretty depressing. And yet, while these sorts of analyses reveal the unprecedented impacts of our species and our human land use and land use change on the world's ecosystems, I want to draw your attention to the dark places on these maps. So don't pay attention to the lit places, pay attention to the dark places. These are the places that have so far been spared from the scale and intensity of capitalist extractivism and in commercial agriculture and other forms of land use that many other regions of the planet have experienced, such as southern Ontario, the continental United States, or southern Europe. The dark places on this map include the Amazon basin, the tropical rainforests of the Congo, the vast deserts and semi-arid regions of the Sahel and the Sahara, the Australian outback, and the largest forest left on the planet, the boreal forest of Canada. The boreal forest is a vast land of ancient woodlands and peatlands, much of which remains relatively undisturbed by industrial development today. The boreal is a very special place. It's home to threatened species like woodland caribou, bison, and grizzly bears. It's dotted with millions of freshwater lakes, wild rivers, and biodiversity-rich wetlands. And the boreal has remained relatively unchanged for at least 5,000 years, roughly as long as recorded human history. It is the very absence of commercial farms, feedlots, mines, hydroelectric dams, transmission lines, and other industrial infrastructure, along with the region's rich cultural landscapes that make the boreal forest so exceptional. The Canadian boreal is also home to over 600 distinct Indigenous nations and communities. These are peoples who have lived, hunted, and traded across the region for millennia. They include my friend, Chief Roland Wilson of West Moberly First Nation. He's Denizah. They include many elders and their family members. These are also Denizah people, Doig River First Nation, Blueberry River First Nation, West Moberly First Nation, and others. And Elder Maya Passon, who I've had an opportunity to work with over several years. So in many ways, we can recognize the dark places on the map as a reflection of not just Indigenous presence on our planet, but Indigenous resistance to the various things that have converted so much of the planet to impacted landscapes. When I was a little boy, my first introduction to Indigenous peoples was in a grade 5 geography class, where my teacher described, as she referred to them as native people, as primitive hunter-gatherer societies. We now know that the term hunter-gatherer is not totally correct, but it's actually kind of racist. In many ways, it's true that Indigenous peoples sustain themselves through hunting, fishing, and foraging for wild, edible, and medicinal plants, but a much more accurate description celebrates Indigenous peoples as gardeners, as farmers, as horticulturalists, as arboriculturalists, and as healers, who intentionally manage their traditional territories to foster the abundance and quality of preferred plant and animal food species using prescribed burning, fertilization, the transplantation of food trees and other plants, weeding and pruning, aquaculture, the building of coastal dikes, dams, and traps, and a myriad of other sophisticated technologies and infrastructure. Indeed, contrary to the prevailing scientific view that still exists today, that these vast indigenous territories, like the boreal, are pristine wilderness or unpeopled places shaped exclusively by natural processes and elements such as wildfire, soils, and climate, Indigenous peoples have and continue to actively manage and tend their territories as a garden. Rather than a wilderness, a true description of the boreal, the Amazon, or the Congo rainforest is as an indigenous biocultural landscape, made up of diverse indigenous food and holistic healthcare systems managed under sophisticated types of traditional governance and sustained for thousands of years under sustainable practices of care, love, and customary stewardship. For the last 20 years, my students and I have been studying the indigenous foodscapes of the boreal forest with a particular focus on Mi'kmaq territories. And we've focused primarily on wild berries. Over 200 different plant species native to what we now call Canada produce small, fleshy, wild fruits. Although commonly described as wild berries, these fruit-producing plants belong to a diversity of botanical classes, including drupes, like cherries and elderberries, pomes, like saskatoon berries, aggregate fruits, like raspberries and strawberries, and true wild berries, like blueberries and cranberries. All types of berries have been an important part of the traditional diet of Indigenous peoples in Canada and other northern regions for millennia, with several varieties, including blueberries, lingonberries, cranberries, and other berry-producing plants, grow well on the acidic and nutrient-poor soils of the boreal and other northern regions. Berries have immense material, social, psychological significance to Indigenous peoples, including subsistence and medicinal value. Being dense in nutrients not regularly available, such as vitamin C, berries remain a staple of many Indigenous peoples' diets. They are eaten both fresh and dried, as well as processed into a variety of foodstuffs, including prepared as juice, tea, and other beverages, made into preserves and fruit leathers, or added to soups, stews, bannock, muffins, and other baking, and even mixed with fat, blubber, or fish to make what is called Inuit ice cream and other types of desserts. Berries, along with edible plant parts, including leaves and roots, are regularly employed in a holistic approach to Indigenous healthcare to treat a myriad of ailments, from easing aches and pains and curing urinary tract infections to assisting in childbirth and even in terms of postpartum depression. The pharmacological effectiveness of berries have been confirmed in several studies, including by my colleagues. Berry species are rich in antioxidants and can be effective in the treatment of metabolic diseases, such as obesity and type 2 diabetes. Berries feature prominently in the historical record as prized items for trade. As prized elements for trade among Indigenous nations and even with European settlers. And today, some Indigenous peoples harvest berries for economic return. The berry harvest provides a rich source of social, spiritual, and cultural connection, connecting Indigenous peoples to the land and the practices of their ancestors. For example, in northwestern North America, the management of berry patches was guided by a very complex political and social system, which varied by group, but which served to conserve and enhance the yield of favorable berry-producing plants. Management strategies used by Indigenous peoples included cultural burning, fertilization, and the transplantation of plants, weeding and pruning, and the maintenance of associated infrastructure, such as drying racks. My mentor, Nancy Turner, and her Indigenous colleagues have described the importance of cultural burning as part of an Indigenous system of plant cultivation using the translation of the Kuala word for keeping it living. This was a term that was shared to them by hereditary chief Adam Dick. While not specific to the boreal, the term illuminates the fact that Indigenous peoples use fire for the active and purposeful management of wild foods like berries to keep them alive and flourishing on the landscape. So the philosophy of keeping it living. Indigenous peoples have long known that periodic burning removes dead and unproductive stems of berry-producing shrubs, enriches the soil with nutrients, and stimulates sprouting and fruit production. In a myriad of species such as blueberry and huckleberry, cranberry, etc. In fact, it's the very absence of periodic indigenous low-intensity burning in which berry patches will become unproductive and will disappear over time. There's a very interesting study that was done by Nancy and her colleagues that has found that vast areas of berry land have now disappeared. And they've largely disappeared from British Columbia because of the suppression of cultural burning. These are places that are now covered by closed forests, and they no longer produce berries to sustain the local communities with fruit. Now, while berries and berry harvesting remain an active part of the social, subsistence, spiritual, and economic lives of Indigenous peoples in the North, the impacts from physical and political changes on the practices have been extreme. The physical changes to the landscape are widespread. They're not just in Canada, but they're across the planet. They include clear-cut logging, mining, dams and reservoirs, extensive off-road vehicle networks that threaten berry patches, not to mention the effects of climate change. Indigenous management and cultivation of berry species is not really well understood, and it's not recognized by colonial governments or even the Conservation Network, to be honest. And in fact, in Canada and in many other countries, there actually are laws, legislation has been passed to actively undermine, suppress, and make invisible these long-standing biocultural practices of Indigenous peoples. For example, in Eastern Canada, the oldest recorded fire ban in North America was enacted by colonial territories against the Mi'kmaq. It was passed in 1610 by British policymakers, banning the Mi'kmaq of Newfoundland from being able to burn their traditional territories. Cultural burning of berry patches continues to be suppressed by the Canadian government today, and it's largely done to promote and protect timber species which are highly valued in our market economy, including to protect timber licenses that have been given to multinational logging companies. The Mi'kmaq that I work with, they want to burn. They want to burn their traditional territories. And in some cases they are burning, but they're burning in secret. They can't actively burn. If they actively burned, the Royal Newfoundland Constabulary would be called very, very quickly. Now, there is a growing awareness of the importance of wild, edible, and medicinal plants like berries for the wider integration of community knowledge and priorities in the management of Indigenous biocultural landscapes. In addition to berries, Indigenous peoples steward many other cultural keystone species that are important, and they include things like red laver seaweed, shellfish, cedar, caribou, salmon, black bears, grizzly bears, polar bears, and bison. And all of these collectively, quote, shape in a major way the cultural identity of a people as reflected in the fundamental roles these species have in the diet, materials, medicine, and spiritual practices of communities. These are so-called cultural keystone species. Now, this concept has evolved in recent years with a recognition that it's not individual taxa per se, but rather complexes of species which warrant attention in conservation and land management, and the incorporation of biocultural knowledge may be better targeted at the broader scales so that we're really talking about the stewardship of culturally significant habitat types, including what I refer to as quote unquote buried landscapes, as these are cultural keystone places for Indigenous peoples. There is a significant spatial mismatch in the distribution and coverage of our existing network of parks and protected areas and berry habitat in Canada. We don't protect berry habitat in Canada. We tend to focus on iconic landscapes like rock and ice, which are very unproductive in terms of the provision of medicinal and food plants. We also have no idea about berry habitat or other medicinal plant habitats on private properties or lands managed under forestry and other land use development and licenses that are given to industry. Now, many of you might be thinking, oh, this is crazy. He's talking about saving berries. I mean, berries are not at risk. Well, some of them are actually, but most berries are not at risk globally. But nevertheless, for Indigenous peoples, they are a priority because they are a valued biocultural component of their landscape. And many Indigenous peoples that I've talked to, including the communities I work with in Mi'kma'ki, have observed a significant decline in the quality, availability, and accessibility of fruit and berry patches. This has been attributed to the effects of climate change. It's been attributed to resource development, pollution, and the overabundance of some wildlife species that compete with people for berries, such as geese, as well as I mentioned earlier, government bans on cultural burning, which is a customary management practice in Indigenous territories for creating and sustaining berry habitat. A recent study on community perspectives on berries found that people in Nunatsiavut can detect a change in the taste of berries, which they have attributed to the effects of climate change, perhaps the drier conditions in the north, or the diminution in snowfall and summer precipitation. But for me, ignoring berries and other culturally significant plants and animals is unfortunate if we ignore these in Indigenous health or in other areas of policy such as One Health. We risk being unawares of the potential threats or the declines in these culturally significant plants and animals that are important to the sustenance of food security and holistic approaches to healthcare. But more worse, we in fact further the erasure of Indigenous peoples, their knowledge and their traditional management of their ancestral territories. It's in the response to the legacy of colonialism and genocide and the ongoing suppression and criminalization of Indigenous land relationships that are critical to sustaining Indigenous food and healthscapes in the boreal that Indigenous peoples continue to resist colonial governments by protecting their lands, waters, and critical food species under their own forms of Indigenous stewardship, their own forms of political governance, and their own forms of legal norms. In the last decade, there has been a resurgence in the establishment of so-called territories of life. I love this term, territories of life. These are Indigenous territories that not only protect biodiversity, but they sustain local food security and sovereignty and ensure the ongoing access and customary use of edible and medicinal plants and other species, such as wild berries and other foodstuffs. Recent research has found that the areas of greatest biodiversity that are found with Indigenous territories globally, and there is growing evidence that Indigenous territories of life and other types of Indigenous managed areas are as good or better at resisting environmental degradation from human land use, as well as sustaining biodiversity compared to state-regulated parks. There's also growing interest in Indigenous food and holistic health systems and other land relationships in the development of Indigenous-led systems of One Health and other policy realms. And I'll give you an example. The agency of Indigenous peoples and their ancient knowledge systems for the first time has now been recognized and upheld in major international policy agreements, tools and guidance, and this includes the Intergovernmental Science Panel Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, so-called IPBES, the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, and more recently, the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. This latter one is very important. It was adopted at the 15th meeting of the Conference of Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, and Canada was host. This was in 22. It's now the focus of talks that are happening right now in Cali, Colombia at COP16. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Agreement recognizes in its preamble, quote, the important linkages between biological and cultural diversity for Indigenous peoples and local communities. The agreement protects the customary use of wild species that are important to Indigenous peoples and local communities, including those with biocultural significance, such as wild food and medicinal plants. Furthermore, 7 of the 23 targets for policy action over the next decade to 2030 explicitly reference Indigenous peoples. And more importantly, it references upholding their rights, their traditional ecological knowledge, and their customary practices, such as cultural burning. For example, Target 9 obligates countries, including Canada, we are a signatory to this treaty, to ensure that the management and use of wild species is not just sustainable, thereby providing social, economic, environmental benefits for not just Indigenous peoples, but for all of us, but particularly recognizing the critical importance to Indigenous peoples and local communities. Target 9 encourages and protects the customary practices of Indigenous peoples in the conservation and sustainable use of wild plants and other food and medicinal species. For me, while this is so important, and it's a reflection of the effectiveness of Indigenous peoples in those global negotiations, is because it emphasizes 2 very important ideas that are central to the work of my students in our lab. Number 1, that biological and cultural diversity are intrinsically interdependent. They are tied together by their coexistence, coevolution, and common threats. And number 2, that the stewardship of biodiversity can be achieved through multiple pathways, not just through the strict protection of nature alone, such as in parks and protected areas. We must recognize Indigenous systems of conservation governance as well. It's important that we recognize and uphold the ecological knowledge of Indigenous peoples, which have long histories of land use and residency within landscape, and who ultimately are the immediate custodians of lands, waters, and biocultural lifeways. And I'd like to give you an example of this, one that I was involved in personally when I used to be the Director General for the David Suzuki Foundation. In 2011, community members from the Deniza First Nation communities in northeastern British Columbia traveled thousands of miles to the city of Victoria, which is the home of the British Columbia government. They were there to deliver a declaration drafted by the elders calling for the establishment of a 95,000 hectare tribal protected area, which they named Katsatse, which when translated to English means old spruce. Katsatse straddles the BC-Alberta border, but it's more important because it's in the heart of one of the biggest natural gas plays on the planet, the Montney Shale. It contains reserves of 449 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and more than 1 million barrels of oil. Katsatse, which is known as Old Spruce, is an area that is held with great reverence by the Deniza as a sacred place. Unlike most boreal forests, which are susceptible to frequent catastrophic stand-replacing fires, Katsatse appears to have escaped large-scale fire, catastrophic in scale or intensity. As a result, Katsatse is dominated by exceedingly rare ancient old-growth stands of black spruce, which are almost unheard of anywhere else in Canada. On one of my most recent trips, I met with the late elder Tommy Atachi, and he told me how he would visit the ancient spruce forests of Katsatse as a child on horseback. There they would hunt moose, they would grieve their loved ones, and they would heal their spirits. He said to me, quote, "We've been there forever, even before they made the border." He's referring to the BC-Alberta border. "We use Katsatse for healing, spiritual healing. We get healed out there and we pray. It's the last place for our people." And he's not joking, because literally, it is the last place for the Deniza, where they can still access these traditional plants and animals and practice those customary practices, because 67% of their traditional territory is under the direct footprint of the oil and gas industry. There is no place else that the Denizah can practice those customary practices that I talked about earlier. So the idea of establishing Kitsatse as a tribal park is important, not just for conservation. The Denizah would never say that we're creating this as a conservation zone. No, they would say we are creating this as a place for us to continue to be Denizah, as we were for thousands of years before Europeans showed up, and for us to practice those cultural practices that are so important to our identity and our spiritual connection to the land. Years of case law, as well as the 2014 Supreme Court Chilcotin decision, have drawn attention to the fact that treaty and Aboriginal rights enshrined in the Canadian Constitution are effectively meaningless if Indigenous peoples do not have access to those traditional lands, waters, and biocultural lifeways, places like Kitsatse. The Canadian government must at least try to maintain the ecosystems that are critical to those rights so that Indigenous peoples can continue to live off healthy populations of wild game, fish, and plants. It is for this reason that Indigenous peoples like the Denizah are exerting their sovereignty in protecting large swaths of their traditional territories as territories of life or tribal parks, or sometimes they're referred to as Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, or IPCAs. Now, Kitsatse is unique because it's being established by the Denizah on land that is subject to treaty. But there are many other Indigenous areas that are being established as IPCAs or as territories of life in areas that are not subject to treaty, but in fact places where Indigenous peoples are exercising their rights through title. And that includes, for example, Dugutst Tribal Park, which was established by the Council of the Haida Nation in 1981, or Mares Island Tribal Park that was established by the Colloquiet First Nation in 1984, and still has never been recognized by any colonial government to date. Mind you, those old-growth forests are still standing. So if you've ever been to Tofino, British Columbia, that beautiful, beautiful village where people like to go and walk amongst the ancient old-growth forests, if you step onto the dock and you look out northwards and you see the beautiful, beautiful mountains covered in old-growth forests, that's because of the Colloquiet. They protected that area as a tribal protected area when it was significantly threatened with clear-cut logging in the early 1980s. I'll give you some other examples. There are Indigenous-led protected areas that have now been established by the Ktunaxa First Nation. It's called the Cutmuck Protected Area. It's the land where the grizzly bears go to dance. This is a very important area because the grizzly bears use that territory to den and to live in, but it's also the source of the spirituality for the Ktunaxa Nation. Taidai-Nenene, which is referred to as the land of the ancestors in what we now refer to as the Northwest Territories. Uichi Protected Area, and Ndeji Indigenous Protected Area as well. In addition to the IPCAs, Indigenous peoples are fostering innovations in other areas of biocultural stewardship that I believe are directly relevant to One Health. Because this is all about sustaining and in some cases restoring land and land relationships. The most exciting development for me has been the rise of what are referred to as Indigenous Guardians networks. These are happening across Canada and across the planet. And it's concomitant with a resurgence in Indigenous-led stewardship of customary lands and waters in IPCAs and other forms of Indigenous governance. Indigenous Guardians are guided by both Indigenous knowledge systems and Western science. Indigenous Guardians are involved in the monitoring of wildlife populations. They assess the impacts of climate change on ecosystems and communities. They conduct water testing. They track hunting and other activities on the land, and they carry out other types of research and stewardship in the management of Indigenous territories. Research has also shown that Indigenous Guardians as individuals benefit from the physical health and well-being benefits of being on the land, especially the youth, and that these benefits extend from the individual to the entire community.
guardianship program is a huge step for us because it's about preserving the land and preserving culture and preserving language. It's an essential thing to our community.
A guardian acts as the eyes and ears in each respective territory. They ensure that everybody's following all the rules and regulations that are placed in all the WE laws, our laws.
We go out and monitor tourist activities, industry activities, fisheries, commercial and sporting. We also do environmental monitoring.
A huge aspect of it is healing and getting back in touch with your Indigenous self. If there's healthy people that are happy and strong in their culture, and if they receive that from being on the land, then it's a huge investment. They're investing in a better society, for a better tomorrow.
In 1973, I paddled on my own all the way down to Skagway. All my life I always heard it is a very strong spiritual place. There's so much brush and debris and everything all over it when I got there. It was just totally overgrown. So I took it upon myself to start clearing the village, just trying to show the ancestors that somebody cared.
Our land is very important to us. We live on it, we breathe it, we work on it. It gives us life. Without it, we don't have an identity.
The best part of being a guardian is being out on the land where your ancestors have lived for many centuries, and just to reconnect with Mother Nature and how your people lived off the land.
There's a gap between the youth and the elders. By starting this program and trying to bridge that gap, trying to create that spark to carry on the knowledge.
We are sustaining our traditional territory not only for us, but for the whole world. Our ecosystem is so pure, we have so many trees, that we are cleaning up a lot of pollution. It means that we are here protecting Mother Earth in order for the rest of the world to live on her.
So now, when it comes to conservation policy, Indigenous-led conservation, be it IPCAs or territories of life or tribal parks, and Indigenous-led capacity for conservation, such as Indigenous guardians, has now become the norm. This is the reality. This is not the case in One Health, and I would argue it's really, really critical. One of the reasons it's really, really critical is that Indigenous peoples for too long have been ignored and thought simply as stakeholders when it comes to their health, especially when it comes to domestic and international policy. As if Indigenous peoples are equivalent to corporate civil society or other organizations rather than self-determining nations with their own inherent rights and governance systems that predate colonial structures, including the very institution that I'm speaking in right now. As I've argued today, Indigenous peoples have been stewarding their lands, waters, and healthcare for thousands of years, and Indigenous rights law in Canada and many other countries provides clear direction that Indigenous peoples have to be recognized and treated as decision makers with political authority and rights over their own traditional territories and communities. Taken together, Indigenous peoples' political authority, their title, their land rights and responsibilities, as well as their own legal norms, values, and knowledge systems are critical to One Health. One Health and wider sustainability must emphasize the importance of developing meaningful relationships with Indigenous peoples. So I want to end my talk by referencing one of my favorite poets. He's an American poet by the name of Gary Snyder. Gary Snyder was quoted as saying, "The most radical thing you can do is stay home." Now that phrase has come to have many associations, but for me it's a testament to the power of place and the profound relationships that Indigenous peoples have with the land. Now, I was a botanist. My PhD is in botany, and the word radical actually originates for the Latin word for root, or having roots. In botany, the radical is the first part of a seedling to emerge from the seed during the process of germination. The radicle is the embryonic root of the plant, and as it grows downwards, it anchors the seed in the soil, thereby allowing the seed to suck up water and send out its leaves so that it can become photosynthesizing, literally so that it can give life. Indigenous peoples' relationships to the land is not only ancient, but like a plant's radicle, deeply rooted in place and will not be easily removed, despite the legacy of colonialism and its harms on nature and communities. Thank you. So in this talk, I want to thank the Indigenous partners that are reflected in the knowledge that I've shared today and the stories that I've shared today. So this is primarily Denizah people of northeastern British Columbia, the work that I did with the Davis Suzuki Foundation, as well as with Mi'apekek First Nation in Newfoundland, and also my students and colleagues in the People, Plants, and Policy Lab. I also want to draw attention to my new student, Madeline, who I'm so delighted to have here. Madeline is our first One Health student in the lab. Our research up to now has been really focused more on the plants, the people, and the policy in isolation. And my hope is that Madeline is going to be able to help us begin to look at all three together. So Madeline and I have been chatting a bit about her research ideas for her thesis, and maybe it would be a great opportunity if you'd like to talk to Madeline about her research ideas or maybe collaborate. We're thinking of doing a study to look at the uses and the significance of wild berries to Mi'apekek First Nation in Newfoundland, with a particular focus on women's health, which is Madeline's priority. We want to investigate the commercialization of wild berry plants from Indigenous territories in North and South America that are being used for health purposes. And Madeline also aspires to study the chemical and pharmacological basis of berry plants that are used medicinally to treat women's health issues. Thanks.